Take it away. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you, Elizabeth and Krista. I'm Chris from Penn, and I'll pass it to my colleagues in a second to introduce themselves. And we, as Lucas said, have been a part of the community of practice, and coming out of that, have done some work to build up a field work rubric that we've really been working on for a long time, and expands beyond the CRSEs, but like the CRSE is a really integral part of it. So introductions, I'm Chris. I run our Urban Teaching Apprenticeship Program. It's a 10-month master's program, and I'm also a senior fellow in the school, and do a bunch of other things. I'll hand it off to Tawanna. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Tawanna Jones. I'm the Associate Director for the Urban Teaching Apprentice Program that Chris was just talking about. And I work primarily with the elementary and middle years cohort. And hopefully today you'll learn a little bit about our Teaching for Justice rubric and how we're using it in both of the cohorts this year.
Jasmine?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Marshall Butler. I am in charge of all the field work for the UTAP program across the secondary and elementary middle levels program.
Krista, Elizabeth, would you mind introducing yourselves and maybe just sharing what brought you to this particular webinar?
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Diamond. I work with the Career and Technical Education Center, as well as teach other classes in the College of Education Human Development. And I'm here because I'm interested in all of this.
And I'm Krista Hunter. I serve as the Director of Professional Experiences at Temple. And our office oversees all of the early field placements for students in the teacher education program, and then all of our field placements for our non-teacher education students. And we also oversee the career development aspects for our students as well. So I'm just interested to learn a little bit more and see what we can do to incorporate everything into our field work.
Great. And I assume you know Luca and Juliet then. So we don't need to do introductions there. Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to learn from you all, since this is just a conversation between two institutions at this point. It would be great to sort of hear your reflections on what we've been doing, and where there are parallels, and how we can learn from you all as well. So we thought what we would do is start by giving you a bit of a background on why we ended up thinking that we needed to develop a rubric, and then go from there into actually talking through the elements of it, what's on the PEDC website, and then from there move into talking a little bit about how we're using it, and then Q&A. Since we're such a small group, if you have questions, jump in as they come up. Feel free to just I can't see the chat because I'm sharing my screen, but raise your hand, jump in, whatever. So we wanted to start by saying, so also this is, the three of us are actually relatively new to the program, the Urban Teaching Apprenticeship Program. And so one of the things we did when we all sort of arrived, although I've been at Penn for a while, I've been working with this program specifically, we sort of started saying okay, what are we trying to do? What is our goal? And so we started looking at our sort of statements of values and purpose. And we found one on the website. We found one on our field review document that was called Equity Lenses. We found one on this very complicated, big sort of Google slide with a bunch of frameworks. We found one in, I'm not sure if things are coming up, right, our handbooks, two different handbooks. I guess one of them already came up. And when we then looked across all of them, sorry, my PowerPoint doesn't seem to be advancing. Now it's going too quickly. There we go. What we found is that they spoke about a lot of similar things, but not a single one was talking about the same thing. and they were making a lot of like claims that were similar about equity and justice. They all did have equity and justice, though they talked about it in slightly different language. But then there wasn't another one that was sort of consistent across all of those. And what we decided we needed to do is first sort of solidify our mission and focus, and then move to something that would help us actually put that like vision into reality. Because one of the other things that we found was that all of these vision statements were nice and really did speak effectively to the purpose of the program, but didn't really paint a picture of like what does that actually look like in classrooms and for teachers. And so I'm going to pass it off to Tawanna to talk a little bit about the process of moving us towards a mission, and then we'll go to the rubric that is the put it into action thing. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. So like Chris said, there were a lot of not necessarily competing ideas that were floating around the program, but ideas that they were not necessarily cohesive in the way that they were showing up. And we had several meetings with the staff and faculty around what is important, what are we looking at, and what are we really trying to drive as a program. You know, what are the foundational pieces, or I like to call them the pillars of the program, based on the themes that are coming out of all of these ideas that are being considered when we're thinking about how to support our students. And so we came up with these three pillars here, which are really centering educational justice, which that was the theme that ran through all of the work and all of the ideas and concepts that we had looked at or had been coming up in different spaces. And so we thought about, you know, what is it that we are really centering? And you see here this idea of the urban school system. So we wanted to make sure that our students know what that feels like, looks like, what that experience is of being embedded in an urban school system. And then we also, another theme that continually came up was work that is student-centered. So how are we making sure that student voices are being considered in the classroom, that they are not being dismissed? But when we talk about justice, we're talking about making sure that the stakeholders, and students are the stakeholders, that how are we really capturing their voices and their identities? And then we ended with this, and not ended, but as you can see, it's a continuum, but thinking about enacting culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. And all of these things also are connected to the work that was happening at PDE, the work that was happening here at PEDC. So when we think about that culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, you know, a lot of these they can become buzzwords if you're not really careful about how you are operationalizing them. And so we wanted to make sure that we were in a process where we were starting to operationalize what it means to be student-centered, what it means to be culturally responsive and sustaining, and what urban schools look like, feel like, what is the experience of being there. And so this graphic represents that. And I think it really captures the work that has gone into the process, but also the work that has come out of it, right? And so I think that's what's really important about the graphic as well. So after we went through again a process with our staff and faculty, pulled out the ideas, or those themes that I like to call them, which have led to the pillars. And then we came up with this statement about what our program is actually trying to do when students come in, and how we want our program what we want to reflect when we're doing work within the program. So I want to give everybody a minute to read over it. And so you can see where this statement, or this mission that we created, is aligned to those pillars and also come out of and are connected to all of the work that was being done at UTAP prior to the three of us showing up and looking at all of that information and pulling it together to say, well, what is the question that we're answering? What is the challenge that we have? And so this message or this mission actually encapsulates all of the ideas in a succinct way, because we could go on forever about each of these areas, but it captures it in a succinct way so that when people show up to our program, they know exactly what is the journey that you're going to be on, where are you headed? And so on the next slide, you'll see where we have identified some key pieces that are critical to the work that we're doing, and again, are connected directly to those pillars. So this idea of a network of transformational educators is something that's critically important. And for each piece that you see highlighted, we are doing things proactively in order to make that come alive, I like to say, in the program. So one of the things about having a network of transformational educators is making sure that alumni is connected to current students. And that's something that we are currently working on and trying to build a database around past alumni, because we realize that although we would like everyone to stay here, they may go to other places and do other kinds of work. But there's a network of Penn graduates from this program, all across the country. And so how do we make that happen? Thinking about educational justice, and that's really where we lean into the rubric that we're going to look at, but in an urban context, right? Because the urban context is often associated with poverty, low income students, but we know that in Philadelphia, that's not always the case, right? You can be working in a school where we were just at a school where I think they said they have 32 different languages in the school, and they have parents who are living in $1 million homes but in that same school, they have parents who are living who have just immigrated to this country, and there are four families living in one apartment, across the street from the school. So when we think about the urban context, we have to be really cognizant of who's coming in, who was in the school that we're serving. And then you see that centering the voices and agency of students, which leans right into that student-centered pedagogy or those student-centered processes that we're talking about. So as we were developing this mission, we were making sure that it was strategically centering the work that we want to see happening. So it's an active mission and not one that's passive, where we're not able to lean into it. But this allows us to really be able to examine what's going on in our program, set goals, and have real measurement around what it is that we say our mission is and what we're doing. Any questions about the mission or thoughts about the mission? I saw Juliet said pulling in all of the values that we have, or as many as possible. Okay, well, we will move on.
All right, so I'm going to transition to showing you the rubric that we built. Actually, before I do that, I should say, so we came out with this mission that centered a lot of the important values for us. And then it was, how do we make sure this is showing up in a teacher education program? And at the same time, we were in conversation as a part of this community of practice, learning from the culturally responsive and sustaining educator competencies. But we have a class that all of our students take a class called culturally responsive and sustaining, or slightly different name. Anyway, we have a class on culturally responsive pedagogy. And one of the things we had been struggling with for a while before that was making sure that doesn't just become something that is stuck in that class, where students feel like, oh, I've done my culturally responsive stuff in the Dr. Brockenbrow's class, and now I can move on and do everything else. We wanted to make sure that they were seeing this as something that was fused both across the program and in their field work, right? And so we thought of the idea of developing a rubric to really use it as a boundary object that could carry some of the competencies and ideas that are being raised up in that course into other spaces by making sure that, All of the instructors are on the same page about what our goals are for our teachers. All of the coaches that work with us are on the same page about what we want to see in the teaching that we're observing. And also for the classroom mentors who we work with in the schools to have a sense of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to develop. And that this could be a tool to really convey some of that understanding, but then also have conversation about what does it really mean to do culturally responsive and sustaining work. So switching over, this is what we built. As you can see at the top is our, I'll zoom in a little bit. This is what's on the website. So I didn't put it in the slide because I figured that you all can get access to it there. But we built this tool that starts with a little bit of a background page that has our mission and then summarizes the, can you all see my cursor? I'm using it like you can see it. You can't see my cursor? Okay, right. So this is a sort of a summary of all the elements of the rubric. And I just, as I'm going through, I'm going to share some of the decision-making that we went through. When we're thinking about developing a rubric, you know, one of the things we were wary of was creating like framework fatigue. You know, we were trying to reduce the number of frameworks because, again, like we started with these 5 different statements about what our values were, and we were trying to bring them together. And so we decided to use the basic Danielson structure, which is the same as the PDE 430, because it's something that we have to do with our students anyway at the end of their time with us to evaluate them for certification. It's a common framework that is used in teacher evaluations when they're in districts across the country. And so what we thought we would do was actually specify it in ways, like one of the, I guess, things that we found with the PD 430, it tends to be a little vague. You know, there's the big boxes about strengths and weaknesses. And so what we saw there was an opportunity to specify it a little bit further and really show where the things that we value show up within planning, within a classroom environment, within instruction. And that is where we link to a whole series of frameworks that you can see here. So these are some of those frameworks that I was referencing earlier, like the equity lenses, and you can actually click on these links in the tool and it'll take you to documents that articulate those if you're interested in digging a little bit deeper. But of course, one of the core frameworks that we drew on was the culturally responsive and sustaining education competencies. But we also drew from this other set of things that are either connected to work that has been done at Penn or tools that we are using that we didn't think they were bad. We just wanted to get it all together into one place, right? We did, and we've been playing around with this a little bit. We did sort of keep the PDE 430 rating scale. And there's been a lot of debate actually within our group about, you know, when you start evaluating, we want to use this really as a formative tool to help drive conversations and help people get better at teaching. But often when they see the numbers, that sort of stresses people out and can interrupt like good conversations between coaches and student teachers. But we have decided to use it because we also want, part of what we want to do is give people a clear indication of whether they're on track for certification and where they need to actually make some improvements. Now, Tawanna, I forget, were you doing planning preparation or was I continuing with that?
I think you're continuing.
All right. I'm going to talk about planning and preparation. So I'm not going to read through all of these points, but what we did was we took each of those PD categories and we broke them and we said, we're limiting ourselves to 4 big statements. This isn't everything. It's not meant to be comprehensive, but we said we can't overload people. We already feel like this is a lot. And so we said, okay, we're going to pick 4 big components, and we're going to then try to articulate like what those might look like. So each of these statements is sort of the setting developmentally appropriate instructional outcomes and goals is a like main component of what we're looking for. And underneath that are some ways that folks might demonstrate that capacity. Right. And so the second one is demonstrating knowledge of content and of culturally responsive and sustaining education pedagogies. And again, articulating some of those places that might show up in their planning and preparation, resources, and then using academic data. Right. So again, this is not just about the CRSE competencies, but it's really trying to integrate them to our whole discussion about like what it is it that we would hope to see from teachers. I'll also say that as we're working through this, we are really seeing this as a living document. It won't change in the moment for each group, but as we are having conversations, like our faculty meetings now, we're diving into each of these rows and thinking about how actually are we giving them the planning tools around culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies. And we're talking about like, okay, so a methods person can say, oh, I'm doing it here, and then our class focus on that. They can make connections in ways that we weren't able to do before. I'm getting ahead of myself on the how are we using it, but that is one of the ways we're actually talking about this. And we're saying, oh, is this actually what we're doing? Do we want to adjust it? How do we make sure that this is really demonstrating and showing what we want to get to? Okay, sorry, I'll hand it off to Tawanna for a bit.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Yes, adding on to what Chris is tapping into about, it's a document that's used, I would say, holistically in many ways. As our program, we're thinking about how is this document used for coaching, for example. So when we have all of our apprentices have a coach, the coaches are able to use this document to help the students set goals for themselves, help them to begin to think about what direction they want to go in. Even this more existential question of what kind of a teacher do you want to be? And this document can be used in that way. We also use it as part of our field review. So as students are going through the year, we talked our first course where Chris pointed out thinking about culturally responsive practices really speaks to what the classroom environment looks like. So there are different times of year that you can lean more heavily into certain parts of this document than maybe other times of the year, depending on the students that you're working with or where they are in their progress. So we really looked at classroom environment for the beginning of the school year, because one of the things when we think about student-centered pedagogy is how are you communicating with your students? How are you developing norms and routines and systems in your classroom? How are you effectively using the classroom space? And these are the things that we want our students to be thinking about, early on in the beginning of the school year. So the way that this is not a linear document where you go straight from, planning and preparation straight to classroom environment, straight to what the next thing is, but it's actually something that you can look at really globally to think about where are the places that the student maybe needs to fill in, or maybe needs some more support and development. Where are they doing really well, but also helping them to know and the reason why it's important to walk through it with them is because learning to teach is an iterative process, and you don't check all the boxes on one domain and then think, okay, now I'm on to the next domain, right? Although it's presented in a linear fashion, we want to make sure that they know that these are things that you're looking at. These are themes that are coming up for each of the students across the school year. You can go to the next one, Chris.
Okay, so you're gonna highlight some of the pieces we're doing around instruction, right? So the first one, again, student-centered and culturally responsive. I really think of these as things that go hand in hand. If you're being culturally responsive, you're probably being student-centered, and you can't really be culturally responsive without centering students. But we do sort of have those two together, and so that's a part of where we're focused, right? Also pushing students towards disciplinary rigor, supporting students to engage with one another. Again, seeing this as an important part of them developing agency, and then think about how the teachers are using feedback, are the three components here. And I'll say too, we've tried to reference sort of where the frameworks fit in. I think that this is another thing that we still have more work to do on. I think there are probably connections that we've missed here, in terms of like connections with all of the different frameworks that we have, because they do really overlap, and point to a lot of the similar things. So I'll hand it back to Tawanna. You want to talk about professional responsibilities?
Yes, and adding on to what Chris said, what's been really effective about this rubric is that we can use it also in coursework. And so a lot of times when we think about professional responsibilities, we're not always thinking about what instructors are teaching in their classes, because they often lean, we think methods, and we think they're doing the content, the pedagogy, how to teach. But when we have our instructors and the faculty actually looking at this, then they can begin to highlight also in their courses, what is it that I'm doing to support the development of our students or these apprentices in each of these particular domains. So a big conversation that comes up all the time, and I'm sure it does in many programs, is who's communicating with the CN, with the classroom mentors or the support teachers in the schools about the assignments that the students need to do. And there's always this idea of, well, is it the instructor that's sending the information? Is it the student who's giving the information? And when you're in a classroom, we think it's important for you to be taking on these professional responsibilities. And so now any instructor can look at this and say, okay, hey, how do I build this professional responsibility piece into my instruction? And is it that I have students go in and talk to we call them classroom mentors here, about the work that they're doing? So one of the things that we've done in field is establish an activity called classroom mentor notes. So we give topics for our students to go into the classroom and talk to their classroom mentor about, or the person who's supporting their student teaching. And we see this as falling under professional responsibility, effectively communicating with people, regularly reflecting on your practice, and creating opportunities and spaces to receive and implement and to receive feedback, right, from your coach, from your classroom mentor, but to do this under the guise of not someone critiquing you for, to be harmful, but as a part of your professional growth and responsibility. So now each person who has a role in a program for supporting our apprentices can go directly to this rubric and say, hey, in what areas can I support, and how can I align my content, even as a methods instructor, to this particular educational justice framework.
We're going to transition back to talking a little bit more. We've been talking throughout about how we're using this because it's so integrated, but I wanted to just stop and see if anybody had any questions, particularly about the tool itself. Well, let's talk a little bit more about how helpful it has been. So I think what we were gonna, Tawanna mentioned that she works primarily with the elementary and middle levels group. I work primarily with the secondary group. Jasmine sort of works across both of them. And though we are one program, there are some ways that we sort of work. They're a separate experience because they're being trained for different things. So the two cohorts do have mostly classes independent. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we're using it in a few different ways. One is in coaching. So we do a field review in the fall, official field review in the fall and the spring. And that's one of the main places this tool is being used. They're actually going to be evaluated on the rubric as a part of their fall field review. And then it's also going to be drawn into coaching conversations growing out of that. So as we highlight areas that might be areas of growth for apprentices or areas of strength, we will be able to lean on that. And again, there are times when we think somebody might not be ready to be certified. And so this will give us more concrete data and documentation to actually help them understand what they need to work on really concretely in order to move towards certification. So yeah, that's a sort of main coaching strategy for secondary. Tawanna, did you want to add anything about how it might be? I think you've been using it a little bit differently.
Yeah, and in the elementary and middle years cohort, we have been using this as part of our triad meetings. And so when a coach goes in to meet with the student and the classroom teacher, they will bring along this rubric. The classroom teacher has the rubric. And I don't know if you mentioned this already, Chris, but we've grayed out certain areas so that we can say, hey, this is not where our focus is right now. Right now, our focus is on classroom environment. So that can sort of narrow it in. And then the coach, the student, and the teacher can have a conversation about how can we build your expertise in this particular area, classroom environment, and then breaking it down further looking at the rubric and saying, well, where are you strong, right? Where are you doing things really, really well? And where are spaces that we want to set some goals that we can work on? So one of the ways that we've been using it is to make sure that everybody is discussing it at least once a month in their triad meetings to figure out how to best support the growth and development of the apprentice using this particular tool.
Yeah. So I realized I smushed the first two together, coaching and field review. They are pretty pretty tightly connected. And so I also want to talk a little bit about how we've, so we have these domains around planning and instruction, but really, the work of teaching is all of that stuff together. And so we have a set of themes that sort of draw on different elements of the rubric. So in the beginning of the year, our classes really focus on relationships for our students. And this is a little bit different than some of you, I think, because like they're folks working with undergrads, but our folks are in 10 months straight. It's the only thing they're doing. They're doing our courses, they're doing field placement at the same time. And so when they first go in, they really don't have much they're not leading teaching when they start. And so we start by a focus on relationships because they can build relationships with the kids in their classrooms. That's one of the first things they really get to do is connect with students. And so one of the ways we've been using this is saying, okay, we're focused on relationships in a lot of different places. Here are rubric rows that are connected to the idea of relationships and how we're building relationships. And so we can zoom folks in. Again, that document is kind of big. It's a lot. We've sort of wrestled with that, if it's too thin, then it's not going to be productive. If it's too big, you're going to overwhelm people. So we're sort of trying to take out chunks that seem like they're digestible. And so I should have added it here, but there are actually 2 rows that are sort of really connected to relationships. And so at the secondary level, we've been using that in a few ways. One, in faculty meetings, when we bring folks together, we are talking a little bit about those rows, talking about relationships, and then each faculty member is sharing how they're working on relationships in their own classroom, what they're teaching, how they are, what assignments they have. For example, in the culture responsive pedagogy class, they have to do a care inquiry where they're trying to explore and understand what care means to particular students. And then in field seminar, they also have to do a shadow a student day. So we're able to sort of do some coordination among the faculty and all getting on the same page. That's been productive. And then also, I think it's helpful for the apprentices to zoom in and focus in on, just a part of this rather than the whole thing at the same time.
Yes. When we are thinking about how we are using the themes in elementary and middle years, it's very similar in that our students focused on relationship building, and we actually had them to go in and set goals based on this rubric with their coach and with their classroom mentor. And then as they go through the semester, they are reflecting on those goals and reflecting on where are their successes, where are they continuing to build skills. Because one of the things that I try to share with the students is that this is about building your muscle memory for teaching and learning. And the more you go to this rubric, the more that you'll be able to, one, evaluate yourself, because as a novice, it can be really hard to see where your growth is actually happening. And so this gives them something really concrete to work with, but it also sort of eases some of the tension that they have of comparing, because I get a lot of students who compare themselves, which is normal, to their classroom mentor, and they want to be just like this classroom mentor in some cases. And we want to be able to say, hey, that's a great place to look for aspiration, but we also want you to be thinking about who you are becoming as a teacher. And this rubric can really help some of that space where it may be hard to imagine, right, what you're going to be doing. And a lot of them say it very early on. I can't figure out how to do this classroom management thing. This seems really hard. It seems there's so many moving pieces, and the rubric allows us to pull things out for them and help them to see their own growth while also planning for how they can grow into those spaces using their resources and using their coursework, and bringing all of those things together, because often it can feel like they're very disjointed spaces. And I think this rubric allows for our apprentices, coaches, CMs, and faculty to be able to see where everything is working in cohesion in order to support the growth of the apprentice.
Great. So we'd love to hear what you all think. Hear what sort of connections, interested to know if what possibilities you see in the rubric, what challenges you see, and what you might need to change if you were going to use something similar in your own context, or if it seems like it makes connections. I'll say, in reflection on this process, I think that what has been really productive and felt good for the program and the faculty within the program was the fact that we were integrating the CRSE competencies into a framework that the program was already committed to. It wasn't something necessarily new. It was something that was new, but being connected to things that we had always been committed to and always been working on. And so it didn't feel like we had an extra burden necessarily. I mean, I think it did help us be reminded, are we missing something? I mean, is there a part of, and I think that conversation still needs to go on as we continue with this living document. But the lesson there, I think, is that like any adaptation should involve an integration of the commitments that a program already has, and thinking about how to weave that into the work that the program is already trying to do. So yeah, curious about thoughts, reflections, questions.
I love the fact that you kept it to 4 and you're making that work. Because when we get to where we have 10 bullet points to get, and then things up underneath those 10 bullet points, right? It's unmanageable for us, much less somebody who's just looking at it to try to use it, right? It's too many words. So this is absolutely fantastic.
Well, and one of the things that we've said, we're only a 10-month program that only have them for 10 months, and we even created this summary because we think even this stuff is too much, at times, but like using this as sort of the summary of all of them. It was a struggle, I think.
I'm sure it was, to be succinct. Yeah. Nice job.
I've got a question. Could you tell us a little bit more about how it was for you or your process of integrating and doing kind of the crosswalk of all those different frameworks? Because to me, that is one of the most valuable parts of this, is how it really shows how things overlap and where the intersections are. But that also seems like a lot of work. Like, you've got a lot listed there. I imagine other programs also use other frameworks. Like, what was that like to compare them all and see where you wanted to like really highlight the overlaps and put emphasis in your rubric?
I'm looking at Jasmine because Jasmine did a lot of this. And I feel like, Jasmine, you should say something about it. I'll say for me, to give you a minute to get your thoughts together, Jasmine. But for me, it was challenging because I think that like it meant trying to know all of these really well. And I'll say I don't know that I know all of them really, really deeply still, but I think it's a way to learn them and bring them together. And that I feel like there's still more to explore. That's where I was saying I feel like there are probably things that I've missed in terms of like where the CRSE competencies makes a connection to this thing that we've been using for a long time and other things. Jasmine.
Thank you. So this Teaching for Justice tool was a lot bigger when we started, because we just were pulling things that felt really important to our mission, and what we really wanted students to walk away with. And we had to make some really hard decisions on like, do we choose this one over this one? Which ones are the ones that feel most important to highlight right now? And I think it's been said a couple of times, like, this is going to be an iterative process. We're not done. So we're trying this out with all of our students this year to see what are we missing, like Chris said. And if we are missing something, where does it go? What does it look like in practice? But yeah, just going through all of these frameworks, that we did find that there were some overlaps. So we're like, we have something here and we have something here, and it's kind of saying the same thing. So how do we just put that into one point on this tool? But yeah, that decision to cut lots and lots of things so that this wasn't a really overwhelming document. I think we sat down, and we sit down twice to do that, where we were like, all right, we're going to choose some things to cut. We're going to come together and figure out if these are the same things that we want to cut. You know, people were advocating for one thing to stay over another. How do we say this in a better way? Lots of decisions as we put this together. But again, we didn't want it to be too long and overwhelming. So where we are right now feels like a good place. It feels like it hits on what we're focusing on right now in the program, and that might change 10 years from now. We might need to totally revamp this, but where we are now as a program, the choices that we made, we feel confident that they are expressing to our students, this is what we want you to take away from our program.
I'll share too, process-wise, that it was, I mean, so we have how many people are our faculty? 20 some, 25? I don't know. It was like, you know, not everybody sat down and did all the work together. So it was like, you know, Tawanna, Jasmine, and I sat down and did some work, and then, you know, Jasmine went away and did some work on it, and then passed it off to someone else, and then we brought it to the whole faculty and said, give us feedback on this thing, and then we went back and tried to incorporate that feedback and make further adjustments, and we dedicated a lot of time to this. When Jasmine says sat down, that was like a 4-hour sit down, or at least. Any other questions? I'm curious, does anybody else have something similar? Like, how do you all do field review? How do you, you know, sort of make sure that, you know, make the connection? Because this was a tool, and the title of this webinar was about making the connection between classes and, you know, making a program consistent or cohesive. And again, seeing this as a boundary object, we're trying to use it as a thing that kind of like ties things together that can often be very distinct in, like, where I've got my class over here, I've got my field experience over here, and they kind of can be different. So I'm curious to know, how do you all do it? Where do you think our pitfalls are here for you know, this effort?
I'm jumping in a little bit late, but this is just really excellent work. We have what we call a set of unit-wide assessments, but we're in the process now of doing our review of our assessments and thinking a lot about how do we incorporate the competencies into our assessments. So, and we're kind of doing the same thing, where a small group of us are talking, and then we're kind of working on it, and then we're bringing it to a few faculty to get some feedback. We were starting with the Danielson Framework, and had connected the PDE 430 to that as well. But I think it's, you know, it's a challenge, just like you were saying, of trying to take all of these things that we think are important or want to make sure our students know, and trying to get them into a way that's digestible and explicit enough that we can assess. And I appreciate the idea of coaching through those and talking with candidates as well as our mentor teachers. I feel like this is a learning tool as much for our mentor teachers that are learning about culturally reflective practice. So I think this is great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I agree that it's a great learning tool as well. And one of the benefits is that, you know, any program or classroom mentor could pick this up and use it in a very practical way and not necessarily have to not have to go through it step by step, but really look at it holistically and identify a particular area where they would like to try to grow in, and use it in a way that, you can pick it up wherever your program is and identify those components that you want to pull in to your program or your practice. So one of the things that I think is really good about it is the flexibility in it to be able to be used across programs, but even across the particular roles in those programs, so that everybody is targeting this kind of growth in the same, in a similar way, or using similar language, right? Because we may all be talking about the same things, but saying it so differently that students pick up on it differently, or our stakeholders pick up on it differently. And this allows for the conversation to be really clear and concise about what it is that we're looking for. So definitely a tool for learning, as much as evaluation, which I think is what we need, right? Tools where the evaluation and the learning are aligned. Luca, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm really curious about this, and this might be just because I don't know a lot about how this kind of works within your program or in general, and how you connect your mentor teachers with your students who are doing their field placements. So I was curious if you could share a little bit more about how you talk about the rubric with your mentor teachers. Like, how do you introduce it to them? Maybe this requires some background on like how they're chosen or how you make sure that they're aligned, or that kind of thing, because I know there can be really complex dynamics there. But I'm curious about like how they're kind of brought on board as well.
Yeah.
That's good, Jasmine.
So when we selected the mentors officially, so that was like June, July-ish. I don't know that we had solidified that this was the final draft of what we were going to be using to evaluate the student teachers. But in my conversations with them, I did let them know that this would be one of our evaluative tools that we were using each semester for the apprentices or student teachers. We have coaches also that go in to support the student teachers regularly. So ideally, coaches would be having conversations with the classroom mentor and the student teacher to say, this is what we're looking for in the fall semester. And we do have a version of this document that's a little bit different for fall. So some of the things are grayed out that we know student teachers just won't get to do and demonstrate in the fall. So for that document, having that conversation, here's where we expect, or here's what we expect to see from you to know that you're on track going into the spring semester. And those conversations, so our coaches have conversations with the classroom mentor and the student teacher monthly, called a triad. So this tool could be part, or should be part of that conversation in the early part of the school year. And then when we get down to evaluating in November, December, coming back up to say, here's what we're looking for. Here's what we're looking for the student teacher to show growth in, so that we can, say that they are on track to being certified in the spring.
Yeah, I'll say this really is the first year this is being used. And so I think how it's going to look in terms of rollout and introduction this year is going to it'll look different next year as we learn from it. This year, really, the coaches are, like in the secondary program, the coaches are really the ones who are sort of introducing it. Now, our mentors, the classroom teachers we work with, have always done a field review that was our old form, which is basically like the PDE 430 form. So it was like planning, strengths, weaknesses, classroom environment, strengths, weaknesses, with with not a whole lot of like specifics. And so in some ways, for people who've worked with us before, this is just making that process a little bit more specific. But then again, we hope that this is going to open up conversations within that triad, that group of people. And then We're also thinking about how we bring it into training at the beginning of the year. Again, like as we're, because I think another step, and this is where we were trying to get to with the COP, the community of practice. I was hoping to get to a shared assessment like across courses. We didn't quite get there. But the idea is that we're going to move towards a place where, like, yeah, we do have assessments that are connected to elements of this that will be built across courses, or we can sort of make some connections across courses. So it'll be a tool there that we can use there. Oh yeah, the language consistency, Krista, that is a really important piece. I mean, like I try to remember this all the time, that like novices, like people who are new to something, they can hear people who know what they're talking about say the same thing, what really is the same thing, but with slightly different language, and they'll think they're talking about completely different things, right? So actually having shared language around things is really important when we're working with new teachers, so that they really can easily see when we are speaking about the same things. And so we do hope this is going to be a tool for some of that shared language to develop. Again, it means we have to use it, right? Use it in the faculty meetings, use it with the classroom mentors. Because I think that's one of the things that happened before, is that there were a lot of frameworks out there, but they weren't frameworks that could be used really easily or like have an application. So there were statements of value that everybody agreed upon, but there wasn't a way to sort of like work on it and use it and like bring it up. And so that's a part of what we're aiming for.
Thank you so much for sharing this,
Yeah.
Chris, Tawanna, as well as Jasmine. This gives it's a lot, definitely some wonderful things to think about.
Well, thank you for
Yeah,
sharing your thoughts and being here to listen to
Yeah.
what we've built. We appreciate it. Thank you all.